Okay, guys, good morning. How's it going there? Just have another 3 minutes pretty much, then we'll get the stream started up. Or, I mean, the stream is going, but then we'll get class going. So welcome back. And yeah, just be right with you guys. Feel free to say hello or anything else. Hey, Roheen, AJ, good to see you guys. Good morning, Fernando, Caleb. Hope you're having a good week there. Ryan. Violetta, Alec, Johnny. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Brianna. Angel and John, good morning. Hey, Delilah. Hey, Tucker. Andres, how are you? Good to see you guys. Morning, Roxana and Jesse. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Now that we have it at 8:30, I'll just get this meeting slowly started up. Good to see everybody here. Thanks, as always, for being up early and attending and making it a fun meeting. So just a couple points to make sure we're all clear about. You have your third homework assignment that will be due next, well, not next, tomorrow, before the end of the day. So anytime before midnight on Friday tomorrow, that's fine. You can email me your third homework assignment, the one about fallacies that you found within advertisements. Some of you have probably already sent those in, and I'm just taking them as they come. They're not due today, but they're due anytime by the end of the day tomorrow. So just keep that in mind. Make sure not to let the due date slip. And then afterwards, kind of coming right up, is going to be this third quiz on Tuesday on this chapter 12 having to do with science. So the notes that we're taking this week in both of the meetings and all the content and information from chapter 12, that's what you want to kind of focus on and study to get prepared for that quiz for Tuesday. And about the third quiz, it's similar in terms of format to the other two quizzes in the sense that you just have to, take it on the day of the calendar that it's designated for, and there's no class period, just the quiz itself. But one thing that's different is that it's worth 10% of your grade instead of 5%. You'll see that in the syllabus. The first two quizzes have a point value of 5% of the total course grade, which is 50 points. And this is a third quiz, so since it's the last one, I'm doubling the point value, so it's worth 100. It's going to be scored out of 50, but then I'm just going to double the total so that you have it out of 100. Anyway, that's your third and last quiz. After that, there's just two more things coming up. I'll assign the fourth homework later on in a week or so, and then you'll have the final exam. So we're coming closer to the end. We have just a couple of things left to wrap up, but keep your mind on those important items so that you don't forget. You have your homework that's due by the end of the day tomorrow, and then you have the quiz on Tuesday about science in chapter 12. The homework, yes, Violetta, I was saying it is due tomorrow. It is due tomorrow by the end of the day. That's right. So anytime before midnight on Friday, April 23rd. That's the exact time and date. Midnight meaning like, leading into Saturday, not midnight tonight. Okay, not to worry. Yeah. And then here's the other thing. I need to make sure to tell you guys this, okay? So let me ask a quick question and kind of make sure that we're all on the same page. Do some of you guys remember way back in the first week of class when I sent around that survey thing as an extra credit sort of assignment? Let me know. Just checking to see, tapping into your memory, that way back in the first week, there was this kind of survey thing that I circulated and said, anyone who fills it out sends me a screenshot, I will give you some extra credit, right? Okay, well, the thing about that is there were two parts to it, which I noted in the beginning too. You may have forgotten, but I said there's going to be part two. There's a second round of survey that I will have to give close to the end of the semester. And so to fully complete and articulate your extra credit, you got to do part two. So I'm going to send this second, I'm going to distribute the second survey after class today during my lunch hour and stuff. So I want you guys to go ahead and please complete the second survey. So all you got to do then is just follow through the link that I'm going to send in Titanium, complete the survey, and please mail me back a screenshot so that I can use that as your verification that you did it. Once you send me that screenshot, then you'll have 10 points of extra credit for your grade. Okay, so that's something that'll help all of you, and it's not too hard to do. It just takes a few minutes. So please make sure to do it. And again, it has not yet been sent. I'm going to send it later after I finish teaching this class. I have one more class from 10 to 11:15. Then between like 11:15 and noon, I'll send this survey. So you got to complete part two, and then you get extra credit. Please do it. I want a high response rate. It's been conducted by the department for the purposes of evaluating our standards in these kind of classes and the way that the students learn certain skills. So by when do you have to email me the screenshot? I guess I was just thinking of a general send it to me, but yeah, you're right, I should designate that. Well, do you have to receive full extra credit points if you do both or one? Well, ideally I want you guys to do both. If you miss the first one and you only do the second one, then I'll award you some extra credit as well, but maybe 5 rather than 10 points. But everything counts, everything helps. 5 points, like for example, would make a difference between like a letter grade on a quiz or something like that. So in terms of your question, Fernando, by when do you have to email it to me? I want to encourage people to do it, so I don't want to kind of set hard deadlines that will turn people away from it after a certain amount of time. But I would love it if people could get it done this weekend, and by this time next week, everyone who wanted to do it has done it. So let's try to get it in within the next week of classes. But this weekend would be perfect. At the same time, if you do it after this weekend, it's okay, because my main thing is just to get your response rate. It's not graded. It's not something that could ever hurt you. It's going to only add credit to your score in this class. So please do it. That's just one thing I wanted to open up with. Okay, well then, let's go back to our notes. We have a little bit more on chapter 12 to finish. That's what we got to focus on for the rest of today. So let me just first start by reviewing some of the topics that we covered on Tuesday, and then we'll move on from there to the rest of it. So starting off, chapter 12 is all about science. And the first thing that was discussed in the chapter is the basic definition of science. So science, what is it? Reasoning from observable facts to testable explanations for the facts. With science, we go out into the world, we observe events that happen, and then we attempt anyway to try and give some kind of clear scientific explanation for what caused those things to happen. So like I think I said in the last meeting, you can imagine people in prehistoric or even medieval times and stuff not having a full grasp of the reasons why things happen in the world. If a volcano goes off, if a solar eclipse happens, if a lightning bolt strikes, if a hurricane happens, or I don't know, how is it that these plants are generating fuel for themselves? These are things that people would have looked at and seen happening, but not really understood the basic underlying reasons. So with science, we try to give explanations for the events that we see happening across the board, whether they're biological, physical, meteorological, astronomical. And by giving these explanations, that gives us more ability to control and subdue the world for the purposes of our interests. So we try to provide explanations that could be tested for their accuracy, which explain the occurrence of the different events that we see in the world. So it starts with observation, some kind of hypothesis about why those things happen, then eventually we test the hypothesis to see if it's true. After that, and well, it was noted in passing that science is, of course, the major source and method of human knowledge about anything in the world. So if you really want to know something specific about how something functions, you would look to science to get the best current day answer. Now, the scientific revolution is a term that sometimes is used in reference to the 1600s, the 17th century, age of reason, scientific revolution. And there were a couple of important Western figures in the early scientific revolution. We talked about Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus's discovery was that the planets all revolve around the sun instead of the Earth. Prior to him, the dominant viewpoint in the West was geocentrism, the idea there that the Earth was in the middle. And why was that so important before Copernicus and Galileo? Because the church held that God would not have wanted mankind to occupy a random, non-central position in the universe. So it really actually was quite difficult and even dangerous for some of these early scientists to profess their results, because they were threatened, in the case of Galileo, with execution by death if they didn't, say that this was false because it was contrary to religious orthodoxy. Anyway, Copernicus helps discover heliocentrism. That replaces geocentrism, paving the way for future scientific discoveries. There was also Sir Francis Bacon, who established the different steps in the scientific method, which is, of course, critical to the procedures of discovering anything scientifically. From there, we talked about what are some given assumptions within science, okay, some clear and baseline assumptions that science makes. One of them is the idea of empiricism. Again, the view that most human knowledge comes from the five senses and from observation. Objectivity is yet another assumption of science. That's the belief that we really can learn about the world and the universe as it really is, and not just as it appears to be, that we can get to the real, true, objective facts about things. The facts are out there and we can discover them, and we can discover them with no bias. So science believes that we can, in fact, discover objective truths because there's an objective reality that's independent of our mind, and we can figure out how it works and what it is. And another assumption of science is the assumption of materialism. That assumption, if you remember, is the view that everything in the universe is just made out of physical matter, including even us and our human consciousness. So according to the physicalist or materialist position, there's no such thing as a non-physical object in the universe. Everything's physical, so if that's true, then even the ability to think and feel and have a point of view in a conscious mind is itself a physical phenomena having to do with brain waves and neurons and synapses in your skull. So if you believed in materialism, then you would think there's no such thing as a disembodied consciousness like a soul or a ghost or anything supernatural. So that's another assumption of science, is materialism, that everything's made out of matter, even the mind. Another assumption discussed was predictability. That is the view that the universe is orderly and predictable. So according to that idea, if there is an established cause and effect relationship that we've figured out, it will remain the same, it will be repeatable, and it would hold forever. I tried to demonstrate by means of this basic example of me holding a pen from like a freestanding height. If I release my grasp on the pen, I think we already know what's going to happen, that it will fall. But it's like, how do you know it's going to happen before I do it? Because you think, well, gravity is the force that's going to operate on it. But when you really drill down a little deeper, you could ask this question: how do you know that gravity is going to work today? And all you would ever say in answer to that question would be, well, it's always worked before, so it's always going to work. And that little last part, since it's always worked in the past, it will never change, it will remain permanent, it is an eternal physical law. That idea is the assumption of predictability, that these laws don't alter, that they don't vary, that they're not temporary or only limited in terms of where they apply. Okay, and then, so whether it was gravity, entropy, inertia, the laws of thermodynamics, these things, according to science and physics, are permanent and stable features of the universe, not just something that will stop happening at a certain future time. Okay, and then unity, one more of the assumptions of science. That was the view that the whole universe is unified, and according to that idea, everything will eventually be able to be explained according to a single unified set of scientific laws. The goal in that case, sometimes referred to as the grand unified theory, is to achieve a set of physical laws and principles that it could explain the behavior of everything in the universe, from the very biggest scales of reality to the smallest little quantum scales of reality. And we still haven't yet quite achieved this grand unified theory, because today we're still working with two fields, quantum theory and relativity. Eventually we hope to build a bridge between those two things to sort of bridge the divide and create a unified system. Okay, after this we talked a little bit, just briefly, about what are some limitations that science has, some things that it's bound to assume but that cannot absolutely be proven. Some of these points were quite philosophical, so I just kind of discussed them in a breezy, conversational way, but one of the issues is that science assumes that the external world exists. Outside of your mind, there's really a world, and it's not just a big dream or simulation or something. This is something that, of course, science has to assume, but we can't absolutely prove the existence of the external world, because after all, if you were in a simulation right now, the simulation would look just like this, so you could not distinguish the two cases. Anyway, I don't think anyone worries too much about this assumption, but it's fair to say that that's something that science assumes and can't prove. Another issue or limitation is that science is all about the things that are observable. So if there was anything not observable, like the soul or God or supernatural, paranormal phenomena, even dark matter, if there were such things, then science could never explore or investigate them, because they're outside the realm of observation, and therefore they are nothing to a scientist. And one more thing was that some people critique the idea of predictability itself, the idea, like I said, that natural laws will be permanent and never change. Some people think, how could you really know that if we don't have ability to see what will happen in the future yet? Okay, from there we just talked about different views about the relationship between science and religion. And I think we mentioned 4 possible attitudes or views that people can have and do have about the relationship between science and religion. So let me just check in with you for a minute. I always like to do that to make sure that we've got this interaction going. So can anybody tell me what they think were at least one of those different views about the relationship of science and religion? Let me know, because I think that's where we closed the class period on Tuesday. So you would see it in your most recent notes. Views about the attitude, views about the relationship between science and religion. So let me see there in the chat, if you could just briefly type out at least one of them or more if you want. And then I'll just pick up from there. Okay, good, Delilah. So that science takes priority over religion when the two conflict. Yes, this is one view. So I can say a few things about it. If somebody thinks that science takes priority over religion when the two conflict, then if there was ever a disagreement between the scientific community and religious scripture or doctrine, the person that holds that attitude would favor the scientific account and reject the religious one. So if there was a disagreement between whether there was a great biblical flood or not, if science says that's not possible or did not actually happen, and the religious account says it does, then this person would reject the religious claims and go with scientific ones. Or if there was a disagreement about the age or size of the universe or Earth or the origins of man, then there would be this scientific preference if that's the view. Other than that, I see you saying, Yelka, that they both have an exclusively mutual relationship in the same reality. Let me think about that, though. What are you saying? Are you talking about the one where they deal with different topics? because if you say mutually exclusive relationship, I guess, yes, you'd swap those two words around, mutually exclusive instead of exclusively mutual, because it actually changes the meaning. But it's okay. So both have a mutually exclusive relationship in the same reality. This is a wordy way of putting it, but I think what you're gesturing at is that they each deal with their own separate topics. So some people believe this, that, yeah, the third rule in the textbook. I got you, Yelka. So the idea there was that they each deal with their own separate topics, their own separate subject matter. Some people claim that religion is all about the spiritual and the subjective and the moral, and that science is about the objective and the cause-effect relationships and the physical. So that's another option for sure. I see here, yeah, Violetta, you kind of expressed the same point. Science and religion deal with different topics. Good. Some will say that they're compatible. That's also true, John. Okay, so if the other view is that they're compatible, that they actually agree. Somehow, maybe if you interpreted religion in a certain way, it would square with whatever science is claiming and saying. So that's another possibility. Like some say, okay, evolution is not contrary to the idea of creation because God created us through the process of evolution in his own image. I don't know, as an example. And then the other one is simply that religion takes priority over science. Correct, Alyssa. Some people will say that if I'm faced with disagreements or contradictions between the two, I will side with the religious perspective and disavow the scientific claims. Okay, good, guys. So then that takes us to where we're at now. So now we'll continue with some new notes from this point on. The next thing in chapter 12 was just discussion of the scientific method and the different steps of the scientific method. But what I want to do before I just go right into that is discuss this point that there's a little similarity between the steps in the scientific method and then the steps in the critical thinking process that we studied way back in the beginning of the semester. So first let me say there's similarities between the scientific method and the critical thinking process. Okay, so with the critical thinking process, you guys may remember, so here I'm going to create two little columns, critical thinking versus scientific method. Okay, so with critical thinking process, if you guys remember, going way back, it starts with experience. That's the first stage, where you just know what happened, but you don't yet try to explain why or how. Okay, so my bike got stolen, I failed my exam, my partner left me, whatever the event was, Biden won the election, it could be something that happened to you or just an event in the world, but you start by just pointing out the event happening and what it was. Going on from there, the next step is interpretation. And that, again, is when the person tries to explain why or how the event happened. Here's why I think I failed the test, or why I think that the person left me, or that Biden won the election, or any other number of examples. Okay, so we start with just what it was, now we say why or how. And then, finally, we get to analysis. And if you can remember, the analysis stage asks, was my interpretation correct? Or is there a better one that's more rational or reasonable? Sometimes your initial attempt to explain something can be clouded by emotion, anger, fear, bias. Sometimes we are more rational and objective in a second look back at the situation and the events. So anyway, that's how critical thinking works. We have experiences, we try to figure out why they happen, and then we even allow ourselves to reinterpret those initial findings later, if needed. Now, how's that similar to the scientific method? Well, there's some basic similarities because with the scientific method, we also start with the concept of observation. Something is observed happening in the world. And that's where you start, just that something has happened, that there's an eclipse happening, or that there's a volcano erupting, or that there are lightning bolts that are coming down from the sky, or whatever. So something is observed in the world of phenomena, but with science, we have to try and give a hypothesis that could explain why that thing happens. So hypothesis, we're going to talk more about it in a moment, but it's like an educated scientific guess to explain the occurrence of whatever you've observed here. But again, with science, once you have your hypothesis, you can't just like say, okay, done, I've got a hypothesis, so study that. No, you have to actually try to test it to see if it's correct. So that's where you get into an experiment. So now how can these two processes be seen in a similar light? Well, they do have a basic structural similarity, because with both, you start off with just some event or experience that you observe. And then when you go further from that, you try and explain why it happened. In the interpretation stage, you try to explain the reason behind why the event happened. With the hypothesis, you try and give a scientific explanation for why the observation of the event happened, so why the observed event happened. And then, in a similar way, when you get to the last step of critical thinking, you revisit your prior interpretation to see if it's correct. So it's kind of like you're scrutinizing the interpretation to see if it's right. And that's how an experiment works, basically, because an experiment tests whether the hypothesis is correct. And it's possible that the experiment will not verify the hypothesis. In that case, you have to come up with a different one. And just like over here, sometimes your analysis will reject your prior interpretation. If that is the case, then you have to come up with a different interpretation. So science and everyday critical thinking are similar in the way they both try to give explanations for things that we then will even test to see if they're right. And the successful result in the end is that we have the right analysis, or we've now found the correct explanation of the phenomena through testing and experiment of the hypothesis. Okay, so then we've just now described these similarities between the scientific method and the critical thinking process. But now I really want us to focus exclusively just on the scientific method and all the steps that are in there. So let's talk just about the scientific method now. Okay, so the scientific method. Okay, so then, the scientific method, something that we all learn usually in our early education. It's a fundamental topic in science courses and the curriculum. I've seen the steps broken down differently occasionally into different numbers of steps. Sometimes people just go with 3. Our book has a little bit more of a detailed range of steps, and it utilizes 5. So let's go over these 5 steps of the scientific method. First of all, first step is to identify the problem. So that's step 1, identifying the problem. And so what we do here, to give an explanation, is we observe the world and we identify some unexplained phenomena. Okay. Okay, so identifying a problem. Science is all about giving explanations for events that happen, right? But if we don't have some event to explain, then there's of course nothing for the scientists to do. So we have to start with some issue or event that we're trying to explain how it happened or why. And that could be any number of things. Like I said before, hey, it should be daytime right now, but the sun is blocked out somehow, an eclipse. And a person might wonder, in an earlier generation of humanity, how did that happen or why? What's the reason? Any other kind of natural phenomena that you can possibly imagine. And in the current day, of course, we still have things that we don't understand, and that's work for scientists of this time. One example that's also mentioned in the book is this. So right now, all around the world, it seems that there's a general decline in the number of honeybees, of bees. this is even termed in the scientific community the bee colony collapse disorder. So it's a problem in a certain way because bees are actually important to the stability of the ecosystem, and they support a lot of other life forms, the way that they carry pollen and etc. and pollinate plants and flowers. And so anyway, what's going on with the bees? That could be an issue, a question that we have. And the first thing is just observing the fact that they are on the decline and that we don't know exactly why yet. So a scientist and an everyday citizen would like to know the reasons for such events as these. In fact, it's not even just the bees. I've read other scientific literature in the last few years that say there's a more concerning broad decline in the number of all types of insects, not just limited to bees. But for the purposes of referring to an example in the book, I'll just use the bee thing. So that could be as one example, an unexplained phenomena that we identify and that we want to explain. So we don't just stop at that stage. Now that we have a problem to try and explain why it happens, we go to step 2, and that is to develop an initial hypothesis. Developing an initial hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? It's really just a fancy sounding word for an educated guess about the reason that something happens. So you basically try to develop an educated scientific guess to explain the occurrence of the observed problem or phenomena here. So okay, so it says develop an initial hypothesis. So now the person, the scientist, develops an educated scientific guess to try and explain the occurrence of the observed phenomena. So these initial hypotheses are tentative at first, and we allow ourselves to refine them a little bit in the light of new information and observation. But basically, yeah, we are trying to give the attempt to take a stab at explaining why that thing happened. So if it's bee colony collapse disorder, we can imagine a couple of different possible hypotheses. Maybe one person thinks, well, if you look at the numbers and when they started to decline, it seems like it's correlated with the emergence of widespread cell phone and mobile technology. Could it be that the development of the cell phone tower radiation that is much more widespread is somehow interfering with the life cycle, mating patterns, or migratory patterns of bees? So maybe it is the widespread proliferation of cell phone towers that is causing it. That's a hypothesis. It's not to be claimed as absolute fact yet because we're just reasonably guessing. Another possible hypothesis could be, oh, well, maybe it has to do with changing global temperatures. If global temperatures are increasing according to global warming, then maybe that is somehow interfering with the otherwise normal life patterns and such of the bees. Well, whatever the hypothesis is, we develop one. And hypotheses start off as these tentative, educated scientific guesses, but if they become confirmed and they're well proven by replication over and over again, then they graduate to the status of theory. So I just want to make a quick point about that. The word theory is really just a very well-tested and well-proven hypothesis. So what starts off as a hypothesis can become a theory if it's extremely well established as a hypothesis through proof and through experiment. So I just want to make that point over here. You know that I'm listing the scientific method, and so these are the steps of it. But just on the side, let's make sure to know that a theory is just a well-proven hypothesis. So we talk about like the theory of evolution, theory of Newton's laws, gravity, theory of relativity. These are things that have been extremely well confirmed. And so, well, I mean, Ghazi, you say at what point does a theory become a law? I think that is a little bit more of a hair-splitting distinction that's tough to mark off. Well, I think, Ghazi, in a way, your question is best answered by thinking of it like this. Sometimes the content of a theory doesn't imply the notion of a natural law or a law of physics. Sometimes theories can be given which just explain the reasons for things happening. Even sociological theories can be given, like economic decline produces more depression, which maybe produces more suicide, and that could be a theory, but it's not necessarily a law because it reflects what has a greater tendency to happen rather than what happens necessarily in every single case. So I think, Ghazi, when we talk about like physics, like gravity, inertia, entropy, thermodynamics, maybe in that case we're more comfortable with the terminology of law because it describes something that is governed by necessity rather than probability. So it's a subtle question that you ask. I think that we would demarcate a range of theories as laws if they are specifically about things that have no exceptions given in the predicted outcome. Okay, so I guess that's one thing I can say, but it's a good question. All right then, so we've learned about 2 of the steps, but we're not at all done. There's more. So I'm going to erase to create room, and we'll continue with step 3. Okay, so the 3rd step then would be to gather any additional information and refine the hypothesis if necessary. So okay, so gather any additional info and refine hypothesis. What this means is that, so now you got your hypothesis, right? And you're preparing to test this hypothesis, but you start collecting some data in preparation for that experimental phase. Suppose that as you start collecting data, you notice that you might have to make a slight edit or alteration to your hypothesis. Sometimes that initial hypothesis must be tweaked, modified just slightly in order to accommodate facts and information that you're learning as you collect data. So this is to modify the hypothesis if needed based on your initial data collection. Okay, modify if needed based on initial data collection. So, for an example, there have been some scientific studies that indicate that there are some higher overall rates of depression and suicide among young people, even in your guys' generation, like Gen Z. If you compare those rates against millennials and Gen X and baby boomers and stuff, it seems like there's a little bit of a higher rate. I've read that in some reports. Now, that could be seen as a problem. That's something that's observed. Young people more depressed and suicidal. What could be the reason? Suppose that one person's hypothesis is this. They're like, okay, well, young people growing up now have grown up with social media more than previous generations did. And therefore, maybe that is somehow leading to increased feelings of, I don't know, alienation, anxiety, social disapprobation, and maybe that's leading to this phenomenon. So that could be a hypothesis. But then suppose the person starts trying to collect some data to investigate their hypothesis, and they notice that people that are using some social media sites don't seem to be having this statistical uptick in depression and suicide, but people that are using other sites are. In fact, one thing I'm referring to here is there have been some studies conducted which seem to show that the photo sharing sites are greater sources of producing people's, I don't know, social comparison with others, you know, like Instagram and stuff like that. So maybe then a person refines their hypothesis a little. What started off as social media may be a contributing factor to increased youth depression rates is narrowed down to photo sharing social media sites are a source of increased discontent and depression within the youth. That's a modification that's possible based on initial collection of data. Maybe with the B hypothesis, someone thought it was cell phone tower radiation, but then they start studying it and they think, no, it's only certain frequencies. Maybe it's only 5G instead of 4G, so they narrow it down a little. But anyway, after you've got your refined hypothesis, tightened up and narrowed it to make it specific, then you're ready to go on to the all-important fourth step. And so this is really key, maybe the most, or one of the most important steps of all in the scientific method, is number 4, which is to test the hypothesis. Test the hypothesis. Okay, so at this point, you basically have to put that hypothesis to the test. So either in a real world or a laboratory setting, you conduct an experiment that will either confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. So let me put that here, either in a real world or laboratory setting. Either in a real world or laboratory setting, one conducts an experiment which will either, one of two possible outcomes. The experiment will either confirm the hypothesis, which I guess you'd like if you think you have the right explanation, or disconfirm the hypothesis. If that's the case, then that wasn't the proper or right, correct explanation of the phenomenon. Okay, so either in the real world or lab setting, you conduct an experiment, and that can confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. So now you're testing it. With a test, you usually want to have like some kind of variable that you can control, and then you will expose a control group to that variable and another not to it, and then you see whether the predicted difference occurs according to your hypothesis. So let's think about this one earlier example I mentioned about bee colony collapse disorder. Suppose that a person's hypothesis was that it's cell phone radiation that is perhaps causing this decline. Now, without getting too detailed, what do you think might be the way of testing that hypothesis, putting that hypothesis to the test? So I tell you, here's your assignment. Run an experiment to see whether or not cell phone tower radiation is causing decline in the overall number of bees. How do you think a person could try to perform a test for that question? To test that hypothesis, you might have to set it up as follows. So tell me, imagine yourself in that role. How would you test this? Or how do you think a person could test this? Just to kind of give us some concrete example to utilize as we go through the steps. So testing the bees die off by cell phone radiation hypothesis. How could that ever be tested? Because you have to test it. You can't just say, here's my hypothesis, take it for granted, and it's maybe true. No, you have to test it. So how could it be tested? This one. It takes a minute sometimes. I know we have a lag with typing and receiving messages back and forth, but I have plenty of time, so just let me know what you think. So the variable is, the cell phone radiation. Knowing that, how do you think you could possibly run this experiment? No science people here? No, I'm just kidding. I know you know how to do it, so tell me. This is like you're stumped on this? You can't, you gotta say something. So go ahead, try. Tell me how to run it. I mean, I'm not saying like, okay, get out a photon beam, start firing it at them and saying something really complicated. It's simple. You got bees. It seems like some think maybe they could be dying off from cell phone tower radiation. How could that be tested? Okay, Ashley. Take a random number of bees and split them into two groups. Expose one to radiation and keep the other from radiation, then record the results and compare the two. Yes, very clear, isn't it? Okay, so you have to have a control group that has exposure to the given radiation, and then another control group of bees that's kept isolated from the same radiation. And then if the hypothesis is true, it predicts an outcome. If the hypothesis is true, what will it predict? It will predict that the group exposed to the radiation will see some kind of dying off or physiological effects that the other group doesn't have. So you run the experiment and there's two possible results. On the one hand, maybe you'll get confirmation. Maybe you run this experiment and you see, yeah, the group that was exposed to the cell phone radiation in that isolated controlled condition, they're dying off exactly as I predicted. So I think I actually have the right explanation. Or maybe you run the experiment and no measurable differences are recorded. You see that the group exposed to this stuff is not at all affected in a way that seems any different from the other group. So that would invalidate your hypothesis, disconfirm it. So you have those two possible results. And this is how science works. A hypothesis is generated, and then experimental verification awaits. And if it happens, then the hypothesis gains confirmation, and it's on the way towards becoming a theory. But if it's disconfirmed, then that hypothesis goes in the trash, and you have to come up with a different one. So one more final step, the last step of the scientific method, is to evaluate the hypothesis based on the test results. So that's step 5. Okay, so to be very clear, this final step is when the person or scientist, the researcher, whoever, looks at the outcome of the experiment, and so they'll see if the experiment confirmed or disconfirmed the hypothesis. If it confirmed it, success, good. That means that you can publish your results, forward it to the remaining members of the scientific community, and then they'll try to replicate the results in their own research environment. And the more people that replicate the results using slightly different methods in different environments, that gains even more and more confirmation. So the hypothesis can eventually attain the status of theory. So, okay, evaluate based on testing results. If the experiment confirms the hypothesis, then in that case, publish the results. For further replication by other scientists. So they try to duplicate your results. On the other hand, what if you don't get confirmation? Well, that's possible too. Obviously, there's a lot of trial and error in science. Not every hypothesis is a home run. Sometimes you run into a dead end. You see this wasn't the right explanation. The tests are not showing it to be true. So if the experiment disconfirms the hypothesis, okay, what do you think? If the experiment does not confirm the hypothesis, it sends you back to an earlier stage in the method. Which of the earlier stages do you think that would ping you back to? So you did an experiment, it didn't show that your hypothesis was correct. You thought bees were dying from cell phone radiation. You hit them with a bunch of this radiation. Now maybe they're even dying less. I don't know, I'm just making that up. But point is, you did an experiment and nothing happened according to what you had predicted. So now what do you have to do? You have to go back to where? If that was the case, you're now sent back to an earlier step. And which one is that? Not step 3, actually, Violetta, because your hypothesis has been destroyed by the falsification. So actually close, but which one do you think actually could be the right number? You might have thought, okay, well now I have to just tweak it again. But not in every case do you get any confirmation that even makes you see that there's some possibility to revive that hypothesis. So step 2, yes, Alyssa. If the experiment disconfirms the hypothesis, then develop a new hypothesis and repeat the steps. In other words, go back to step 2 and repeat. And you're going to keep doing this until eventually you do develop a hypothesis that does receive experimental confirmation. So it kind of sends you back to not all the way to the drawing board, because you still have the same problem to explain. If you were worried about why are the bees dying off and the radiation hypothesis didn't check out through testing, then it's not like you move on to a different problem. If you're still interested in answering this question, why it's happening, then you've got to try and develop a different hypothesis, and you keep on working until something is proven true or experimentally confirmed. Yeah, so science, this method that we're talking about here, this is the reason that I'm able to speak with you right now through this device. This is the reason that all of our technology exists, all of our medicine exists, all of the innovations in architecture, in communication, transportation, energy, they're all developed on the basis of observation, hypothesis, and then experiment to determine how things work so that we can deploy technologies, medicines, and all other forms of just knowledge that equips us with an understanding of how to control the world and to maximize our self-interest and communal interest as human beings. So we owe a lot of gratitude to the scientific method. It makes our lives this modern life that we live so that we're not just agrarian farmers living off of the land with no trappings of modernism. Some people, of course, don't prefer the modern trappings of life, but at the end of the day, you know, this is the direction that human beings have taken the world. And for the most part, a lot of this stuff does improve our lives and our quality of life. So science is a huge benefit to us. Learning about the scientific method kind of reminds us of its fundamental importance, but it's really just a logical procedure where we start by observing the world, trying to explain things that we see there, and then testing those explanations until we get the right kind of confirmation. Okay, now, having spoken about the scientific method, the last stuff in chapter 12 goes over what they call qualities of a good scientific hypothesis or theory. So what are qualities or attributes that a good scientific theory or hypothesis would have? Not every theory or hypothesis is equal. Some are more accurate and plausible than others. So we want to be able to distinguish between the two cases of a good and a bad hypothesis. This will give us ability to do that. So here are some qualities of a good scientific hypothesis or theory. Okay, so one is just relevance to the problem being studied. So sometimes we can just dismiss a hypothesis right away if it's totally not relevant to the topic being investigated. And sometimes people, usually not skilled scientists, but just sometimes everyday people and people in the media and less informed people will generate hypotheses to explain things that have nothing to do with what they're trying to explain. So like, I don't know, you can imagine a person sees that hurricanes have been more intense in the last 30 years over hurricane season, and they're wondering why. Why is that? You know, according to the data we have, we didn't have such bad hurricanes in, let's say, the 80s and 90s, and then they're much worse since the 21st century. Maybe somebody looks at that and they study other facts about our society, and they see that the divorce rate has been on the increase the whole time. So they think, I'm connecting these two. There's a correlation, so I think there must be a causation. You know, if divorce rate has increased and hurricanes have gotten worse, maybe the hurricanes are getting worse because of divorces. But that couldn't possibly be a relevant hypothesis, because sociological fact about people making up and breaking up has nothing to do with meteorological facts about the weather and the climate. So perhaps it's a hypothesis of a kind, someone's trying to explain something that way, but it's not relevant enough to even be considered. So that's a baseline fundamental of quality. A good hypothesis has to have. It has to be relevant. It has to be about the topic of discussion. Secondly, a good hypothesis or theory should be consistent with other well-established theories. So okay, so let me explain that one in a little more depth. A good hypothesis or theory should fit in with and should not contradict others that have already been pretty well proven in the past. Okay, so a good hypothesis / theory will fit in with and not contradict other well-proven theories. So it should fit in with, not contradict other well-proven theories. That's what a good hypothesis or theory should do. So I'll try to explain this with a little bit of a metaphor to you. Think of science, if you would, as like a big jigsaw puzzle, okay? And each piece should fit in with whatever else is already there. So when you add a new piece to this puzzle, if it stands out and it doesn't fit, then that's not so good. Science is supposed to be, I've heard the metaphor used of new scientific research and discovery is like standing on the shoulders of giants, because you're standing on the body of work from all the previous generations of scientists that have come before. So you're supposed to basically be stacking up onto this growing body of knowledge, not destroying and clearing away everything from the past generation with each new generation, right? So a good scientific theory should fit into the existing body of knowledge, not contradict it or force us to reject things that we think we've already proven pretty well. This is kind of maybe it's a silly example, but suppose that a person notices that they have Christmas gifts under the tree on Christmas Day. And it's like their question is this: how did they get there? So they have one hypothesis which says that Santa delivered them. But think about the Santa hypothesis when it comes to the question, where do my presents come from? If you really agreed with that hypothesis, it would force you to reject so many other things that we know scientifically. For example, if Santa does deliver the gifts as said in his sleigh, that violates all kinds of laws of aerodynamics, because the mechanism of the sleigh being driven is through reindeer, which are they're flightless terrestrial mammals. So that would violate everything we know about how things are able to achieve flight. So to make way for the Santa hypothesis, we have to give up on everything we thought we knew about physical principles that make something capable of flight and aerodynamics. We'd also have to make weird concessions about how matter could possibly be conserved and condensed, because if he's going to deliver everybody's gifts on that night, then I don't understand what kind of storage mechanism can allow it to all fit into his bag or onto his sleigh. So that seems to violate, principles of physics as well. So, the Santa hypothesis, as attractive as it may be, it's to be rejected because it's not consistent with, with gravity, with aerodynamics, with other physical laws. And so in general, yeah, when there's a new theory that arrives on the scene, unless it's a revolutionary theory, that's the only kind of exception to this. Like, okay, Einstein and the relativity theory did revise certain of the Newtonian laws of physics, but it takes overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence for some kind of theory to displace older ones that we thought we really knew in the past. So for the most part, with some very rare exceptions, a good theory or hypothesis will fit in nicely with the others that have already been developed, and it will be consistent with them, so it does not contradict them. We're not supposed to have to pick between a new theory and an old one. It's supposed to be built on top of the old ones. Okay, so that's the second quality that's mentioned in the book. And from the book, I'll just quickly read the way it puts that. It says here, science is a system of logically consistent hypotheses or theories. Scientific explanations are preferred if they are consistent with well-established theories in the field. This system forms a paradigm, or a particular way of looking at and explaining the world. For example, the new hypothesis that internal processes in the ocean, such as the release of oceanic methane hydrate deposits that exist on the seafloor on continental margins, are the primary cause of global warming, is considered a good hypothesis by environmental scientists, since it is consistent with the established paradigm that global warming is the result of a combination of man-made and natural changes. The intelligent design theory, on the other hand, does not meet this criteria because it is inconsistent with the well-established theory of evolution. So just a little bit of comment from the book to add to this. Now we can move to the next. There's a few more. So other qualities of a good scientific theory. Next, we will talk about what's called simplicity. Okay, so simplicity, and I just want to put in parentheses below because it's sometimes also called by another title of this particular concept. It's sometimes called Occam's razor. And it's called that also because it's a reference to this medieval philosopher and theologian named William of Occam. And he's one that proposed this idea, which we still hold as a truth today. So Occam's razor, or if you want, simplicity, is this idea that when you have two explanations for a given phenomena or an event, the simpler one out of the two is likelier to be true. Okay, so simply stated, the simpler of two explanations for an event is likelier to be true. Yeah. One second here. Oh yeah, so you see there, the simpler of two explanations for an event is likelier to be true. Now, let me walk you through an example that can explain this. Science assumes that the universe is kind of elegant and parsimonious. So when you have two explanations for something, and one of them involves more assumptions than the other one, then the one with the additional assumptions is just less likely to be the true explanation. Think about this, okay? So you get to wherever you park your car. You park your car somewhere, you get out, you do something, come back to, drive off. Suppose that when you get back to that parking spot, the car's not there. So that would be a problem. And right at that point, you'd start kind of trying to reason about the reasons why or what happened. This has happened to me at least one time before, so it's something I know can happen. But anyway, let me ask you, what would be a possible hypothesis that you might formulate as to what happened to the car if you came back to your parking spot and your car wasn't there? There's different possible hypotheses. What could be one that you might go with? Let me see if you guys have any thoughts on this. So the topic is missing car from the parking spot. And the question is, what might you give as an explanation for that? What would be your initial educated guess that might give you some kind of answer here? At least a tentative suggested answer. Okay, one possibility, good, Roxana. You might say it got stolen. Same thing you're saying, Ashley. Perhaps the reason that your car is not there in its space is due to it having been stolen. This could be the right reason. Could be that it got towed also, Ashley. Yes, maybe it was parked in a designated stall that it's not supposed to be in, and that allowed the tow service to take it to the towing lot. That's another possibility, Violetta, that maybe you actually have a false memory of where you had parked, and this is not the actual stall. So these are all definitely viable hypotheses. These are all suitable explanations that could, give the real reason. But let me give you another hypothesis, okay? So I'm going to compare just two. Let's go with the towing hypothesis as one, and let's compare it against this other one. So someone says, here's the two choices of explanation. Maybe it got towed, or maybe aliens came down from another planet somewhere, and they took the car away to investigate it, because they're trying to look at human earthling technology. So now I'm giving you two choices, the towing hypothesis and the alien abduction hypothesis. They're both hypotheses, I guess. You know, they're both trying to explain why this thing is not there. But one of them is much more complex and one is much more simple. And so the simpler one is the one that the scientist would say is likelier to be true. So which of those two do you think is simpler and does not involve as many assumptions? Is it the towing hypothesis or is it the alien abduction hypothesis? Just let me know. If you had those two choices, wait, no, Violetta, come on. I said which one is simpler. Maybe you didn't hear my question right. So please, may I ask again, which of the two hypotheses is simpler? That it got towed? Yes, that it got towed. Okay, so about aliens, right? What extra assumptions do you have to make to sustain that hypothesis that you do not have to make if you assume the towing hypothesis? So like what extra stuff does a person have to assume that nobody has to assume for the other one? If it's aliens that abducted it, then you have to assume things like what? You have to make all kinds of assumptions. For example, assumptions of things that you don't know yet. Like, for example, what? Just let me hear that. That they're real? Yes, correct. So you first of all would have to assume there are aliens that exist in other planets. But you'd have to even assume more than that. Not just that they are real, but that they're so advanced that they're able to travel to the planet Earth from wherever they are. And since they're not in one of the solar system planets, then they would have had to travel light years from, you know, even the most close near stars, 4 light years away. So we would assume that there are aliens, that they're hyper intelligent aliens that can build interstellar transportation. We would have to assume that they're interested in your car of all things for some reason. So not to say that that's, I mean, theoretically or like inconceivable, but it's just, it bears so many extra assumptions built into it that it's just less likely to be the true explanation. And that's how science in general functions. I know I'm giving you a kind of silly example. Scientists would never actually pose these hypotheses. But in real scientific practice, if you get two explanations for a given event, then the simpler of the two is the one that you would break in favor of. That's what William of Ockham said back in the medieval period. And that principle is built into science, and we sometimes call it Occam's razor, or sometimes we'll just call it simplicity. Yeah, also, Alyssa, how'd they get the car up there? I guess they could beam it up or something. Yeah, so there's all kinds of assumptions that you would have to make. And that's what it does say here. It says in the book, if different hypotheses both satisfy the basic criteria, scientists generally accept the one that is simpler. A logical principle known as Occam's razor, named for the medieval philosopher William of Ockham. The great majority of scientists reject intelligent design theory because, among other reasons, the theory of evolution is simpler than that of intelligent design. The process of evolution alone can explain the gradual development of complex organs such as the human eye, beginning with light-sensitive cells that primitive organisms possess. So there would be no need to add the idea of an intelligent designer to the process. Yeah, not like trying to say that I agree or disagree with the claims about the legitimacy of religious views in scientific discussion, but some do say that like the intelligent design hypothesis, which says that God created all of these beings with the current body parts and appendages and adaptations that they have, rather than them having evolved, that does require the assumption of a supernatural being that has some kind of mysterious relation to the natural world and the things that happen within it. And such additional assumptions are not needed on the natural selection hypothesis, which just hypothesizes that organisms through natural selection tend over a very long span of time to evolve the traits that equip them for survival in their own environments. So anyway, some words about simplicity, or AKA Occam's razor. So we go on to just a couple more of these qualities then. And the next one is called falsifiability. Okay, so falsifiability. It's an interesting concept. In a way, it might sound to you a little counterintuitive at first, but let me just say this. It is a good thing when a scientific theory is somehow able to be proven false. And that might strike you as odd, because you might have thought, well, why is it a good thing if it can be proven false? I thought the whole point is to prove that it's true. Yes, but that it can be proven false does not mean that it is, or that it will be proven false. It just means that there's some way that we could at least test whether it was false or not. See, if we don't have any way of knowing how to test whether the claim is false, then we also don't have any way to prove that it's true. So falsifiability is a requirement for something to be capable of being tested. So let me put the point here. A good scientific theory is able to be proven false. Good theory, able to be proven false. Falsifiable, able to be proven false. Going back to the question of the bee colony collapse thing, if I suggested my hypothesis was that it's cell phone radiation, that hypothesis can be falsified in the exact way that we described. If you do an experiment and it does not show any measurable effect by being exposed to that variable, then we would say, a hypothesis was not confirmed. But it's very important that we at least have the ability to check whether it could be false, because if we don't know how to check whether it could be false, then it's an unscientific claim, because scientific claims have to be testable. And it's not testable if there's not even any way that it gives you to check for it being false. So non-scientific, pseudo-scientific claims like the horoscopes, that's not falsifiable because they don't involve any tests that are conducted to verify what they're saying is true. They don't tell us, here is the way that you could falsify our practice. If you do this experiment and these results don't happen, then that will falsify the claim. So go ahead and test it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. In those fields of pseudoscience, there's no mechanism to falsify the claim. If you read like an astrological chart and it says you're going to be visited by like a friend this week, and then you say, no, that didn't happen, they won't claim that that's falsification. They'll just say, oh, you didn't pay attention enough to what was happening in your own life, so you didn't notice that a little bird perched on your balcony or something, and that's maybe what it meant. So they offer you no mechanism by which to falsify the claim, and that's how you know it is not scientific, because real science says, don't just take my word for it, go ahead and perform this test, and if you see these results, then I guess it's not a true theory. Take Einstein, for example. In his theory of relativity, he said, if my theory is correct, then it predicts that when we have a solar eclipse, you should actually be able to see light from behind the occluded object of the sun that's bent around its surface, because mass actually has the property of bending light. It has a gravitational effect on photons of light. So he says, wait for a solar eclipse, look up there with telescopes, and if you see the stars that otherwise should have been blocked by the occlusion of the moon and its sun's light, then that would verify my hypothesis. But if you don't see the objects occluded by the lunar surface that blocks the sun, then that's disconfirmation. So, we actually performed the experiment. We did not get the disconfirmation, and so that added further credibility to Einstein's theory. But again, he did not just say, take my word for it. He said, perform an experiment, because my hypothesis predicts that this will be the result of the experiment, and you can compare this prediction to what the results are, and maybe you will get that result or maybe you won't. So yeah, let me read from the book about that. It says, a hypothesis or explanation should be presented in a form that is testable and can be repeated by other scientists. In addition to being testable, an explanation needs to be able to be falsified. Philosopher Karl Popper pointed out that no number of positive outcomes of an experiment can confirm the theory, but a single counterexample is decisive because a counterexample proves that it's false. Therefore, one of the main tasks of a scientist in testing a hypothesis is the search for negative falsifying instances. For example, the hypothesis that all swans are white was based on the observation of hundreds of thousands of swans, every one of which was white. However, the hypothesis was falsifiable since it would only take one non-white swan to prove that it's false, which did happen when black swans were discovered in Australia. Another interesting and funny example of non-falsifiable hypotheses and claims is some of the work of Sigmund Freud. I don't know if you guys have learned about Freud a little bit, but on the one hand, he's widely regarded as like the father of modern psychoanalysis, and he's a big figure in the early history of psychology in the West. But he also had a lot of weird ideas that are kind of not scientifically based, that are not falsifiable. And some people think he came up with this stuff just when he was on a lot of cocaine back then. People didn't know how bad of a drug it was, because it was even included in like certain consumer products like Coca-Cola. But anyway, he's on a lot of that stuff, and he made a bunch of weird theories about like proto-sexual attitudes that he thought little children had. So like, for example, he thought that there's such a thing as the Oedipus complex, which is when a little boy growing up has a latent sexual attraction for the mother figure, which plays out in later life when the boy becomes an adult and tries to find a partner that's similar somehow to the mother. And he thought also that little girls have this, what he calls the Electra complex, where they have a latent sexual attraction to the father figure, and it plays out the same way in their later life. But there's no kind of scientific evidence for these things that he said. And if you told him, no way, Freud, that's just weird. I never had any kind of conscious or subconscious interest in my parent. He would say, oh, well, that's what you're saying, but it's because you've suppressed it into your subconscious mind, so you'll never be able to prove that you don't have those thoughts. Well, if there's no way of proving that this is false, that his claims are false, then he's really just giving speculation that's not scientifically judged or capable of being judged by an experiment. So that would be problematic. He also had stuff about like penis envy, he thought that little girls had, and so yeah, a lot of those things have been just dismissed and marginalized in his work. But the idea of the subconscious has endured, and that is still something that's relevant to psychology. Okay, so falsifiability, everybody. And then just maybe one more really quick. There's also what's called predictive power. Okay, so predictive power, that is just a good scientific theory can be used to accurately predict future events. Okay. So science is an interesting thing in the sense that it kind of allows us to predict the future. Take the weather report. When you hear the weather report and it says there's an 80% chance of rain on Saturday or whatever, that usually bears out to be true. You know, it's not 100% perfect, but for the most part, it's not just a guessing game where they're like, hey, I'm taking a wild guess that it's going to rain. Bring an umbrella if you want, but maybe, maybe not. No, we have pretty reliable predictions there. And that's just one field of science which issues very correct and accurate predictions of future events. Think of astronomy, which tells us about the exact date and time that there will be another lunar or solar eclipse, and then it happens on that exact date and time. Even sometimes we know about this 10, 20 years, 30 years ahead of time. When we have these predictions issued by a scientific field, and then the thing happens in exactly the way specified by the prediction, that gives us further credibility that that's a correct body of theories and that it's not just people kind of randomly guessing or something. So to the extent that theories issue predictions that result in fact, that is another mark in their favor that adds to the quality of a good scientific theory. Now the last thing in chapter 12, so we have reached the end, but I don't want to let this go, so just give me 1 minute. The last thing is just a reference to pseudoscience. And pseudo means literally fake, so this is kind of like fake science if you really wanted to just be blunt about it. What is pseudoscience? Well, it's something that wants to look scientific, but it's not really. So the book says it this way. It's a body of explanations that masquerades as science, meaning that it puts on like a false appearance or pretense that looks like it's science, but it's not really. A body of explanations that masquerades, wearing a false appearance of being such, as science. But it's not really. So what are some examples of pseudoscientific fields? A lot of times they issue predictions in very vague language so that nothing could ever be falsified on the basis of what is predicted. They never involve experiments to verify their claims. So they're not built on scientific principles. You have to think of things like astrology. What are some others that you know about? Numerology, thinking that numbers have some kind of supernatural significance. Psychics, tarot cards, crystal ball gazing, and so on and so forth. Don't be gullible or susceptible to the false claims that are made by pseudoscientific fields. Oftentimes they're being made by people who are peddling products or trying to make a profit off of you for the sake of your gullibility. If you look at the old writings of Nostradamus, who some people thought predicted all kinds of future events way back in the past, like 9/11, and if you actually read the text that they say was the prediction, it's really kind of just funny that anyone would have thought this was the prediction. So it says, fire of the center of the earth shall make an earthquake of the new city. Two great rocks shall war against each other, and after that they shall color red the fresh water. It just says something about rocks, fire, red water, and a new city. But if you really was to interpret that as having to do with 9/11, I mean, you'd be pretty gullible. The same kind of statement could be used to perhaps be claimed as a prediction of almost anything involving war, conflict, or two separate factions. So I guess then that's really about it for us for today. Sorry to keep you guys for an extra minute there at the end, but I wanted to make sure not to leave behind the definition and some examples of pseudoscience. So now that means that on Tuesday you're all ready to go for the quiz for chapter 12. Make sure to be prepared and look over the notes and read the pages in the book. And I'll just have the quiz ready for you at 8:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning. But between now and then, don't forget to turn in that the third homework rather, tomorrow, anytime before midnight, so that you get it in on time. All right, guys, so I'm going to let the stream go now. Let me see if you're all right. Just let me hear if you're feeling like saying goodbye, or if you have any questions, let's just know what they are. But I'm ready to close the stream. So are we all good? Okay, perfect, guys. Thanks again. Have a great weekend, and I will be in touch. Take care, and I'll see you soon.